everybody. So, welcome to Transcendence Talks podcast. I'm so excited today to be here with my friend Mysti Rainwater. She is also an owner of a group practice, the Center of Progressive Therapies, and she trains around the world talking about Enneagram empowered psychotherapy, teaching other psychotherapists about integrating the Enneagram in their own practices as well. So, welcome, Mysti. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me, Christy.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I did my own research, on the Enneagram. I'm pretty new to it before having you on. And of course, I had to take the test. I found out that I'm a 2, which made a lot of sense to me. I also lean very heavily 3. So that was really fun to explore. But I can see why, after taking this test, why you fell in love with the Enneagram. But I'm so curious to hear your story. Like, how did you stumble across this tool, and what was that like for you?
Yeah. So it's interesting. Everybody seems to have a story of like how they met the Enneagram. Yeah, you'll hear in the communities. And so I actually met the Enneagram many, many years ago when I was in my early 20s. And I remember at the time thinking, this is woo woo. This is weird. I have zero interest in it. But I was in love with personality. And I've got a story about that that's probably for another day. And so I started looking into Myers-Briggs type indicator because I knew already that I was very attracted to the idea of Carl Jung and Jungian archetypes, if you will. That was my first introduction. And so I traded in the Enneagram for Myers-Briggs. I got certified. And then as soon as I started practicing as a counselor, I used personality in my work from the very beginning. I just thought that there was so much value, and I did that through Myers-Briggs. And then about 15 years ago now, I was reintroduced to the Enneagram through another therapist friend of mine. She had asked me to go to a random training here in Phoenix. And I'm sitting in the room in this Enneagram training thinking, oh my gosh, I can't believe I haven't been using this the entire time. This is so juicy. It's so good. There's so much data and information that you can gather from clients using this tool. And so I jumped in right away, decided to get certified as they sort of call it in that community, like a teacher. So a certified Enneagram teacher. Yeah. But I happened to find one of the certifications from a man named Jerry or Jerome Wagner, who has a company called Enneagram Spectrum. And he is a psychologist in Chicago, but also was one of the first people in the U.S. Many years ago in the early 80s to write his doctoral dissertation on the Enneagram.
Wow.
So once I was introduced to his work, it made so much sense in my world. And then was using it with my clients, had such good success that I started training my own clinicians who work either with me or now in my group practice. And they all were having such good success that I actually ended up developing a course called Enneagram Empowered Psychotherapy to be able to bring this to other clinicians around the world.
Wow, that's amazing. So it sounds like his work almost brought it from woo-woo into the realm of science, for you. It almost feels like that was an invitation. Like, okay, now it's okay to bring this into the office, into the counseling space.
Yes. And I would say, so Jerry was one of the first authors amongst a whole bunch of other authors when the Enneagram first kind of landed in the United States, and people went different directions with it. But another person who has really taken this to the next level is Dan Siegel. Are you familiar with Dan Siegel's work?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So he wrote a book in the early, or I'm going to say, he was doing some work with some Enneagram people, though he was already a known psychiatrist. And then I think in 2009, he wrote a book called Mind Sight. And that's where he actually introduced that he had been working with some folks in the world of the Enneagram. And he identifies as an interpersonal neurobiologist.
Wow. Okay.
So that really brought the work into the scientific arena from from the more, we could say woo woo or we could say spiritual
Hmm.
arena. And there's value to all of them. It just was a matter of what I connected to.
So let me ask you this, speaking about what you connected to, um, how did the Enneagram change how you saw yourself, how you saw your clients, you know?
So I was already doing personality work using Myers-Briggs, and I'm a fan of a lot of different sort of typologies out there, including like DISC or True Colors. Those are some that other people have thought about. Even love languages in some ways is, considered a bit of a typology. So my story began when I was in my early 20s. I was actually at an Amway convention, and I
Okay.
remember this person standing up on, I never made $1 million selling Amway, by the way. Darn it. So I had to become a counselor. I was standing on the stage listening to somebody talk about personality, and I just had this aha moment of, oh my gosh, this is why I have so much conflict with people when I don't intend to have conflict.
Okay, so
And
what is
so
your Enneagram type?
So I identify as a type 8 on the Enneagram. And for those listeners who are familiar with Myers Briggs, I identify as ENTJ or ENTP. And both of them really align with what I learned about myself from the Enneagram as well. And Enneagram type 8s are notorious for having conflict when they don't intend to have conflict. They're well intended, but the energy that comes through to other people can often be misidentified. So the real moment of truth for me was learning that about myself and understanding about myself, not to focus on my intention, but instead focus on how I affect others, whether or not I intend to. And Christy, I'll tell you, my relationships have been so much better with that kind of just mindfulness and awareness of how I'm affecting others.
I can only imagine that was such an aha moment, especially if that's maybe a part of yourself that maybe you didn't understand fully or completely. Why is this happening? My intentions are good. Maybe feeling misunderstood often. I don't know.
Yeah,
But
for sure.
yeah. And how did that land on you when you read about that? Was it hard to hear that information that others may not perceive you the way that you intend, or was it a relief?
It was a huge relief, definitely, because it helped me understand where the conflicts were originating. And then one of the pieces that I really love about the Enneagram, and this is where it starts to cross over into other psychotherapy modalities, is there's a portion of the Enneagram that many of the authors write about called the childhood wound. And
Mm.
it really starts to walk each type through probably what occurred as a child and in ways that we didn't perceive ourselves, whether real or imagined, as being safe, and strategies that we developed to help keep ourselves safe, and how we then continue to use those same strategies as we get older, even with situations or people that we no longer need to use them. So that's where it really landed with me, the value of understanding. I always kind of joke with other therapists, right, that we all become therapists for a reason.
Yes.
And part of that reason was I was raised by a mother who was addicted to pain medication. I didn't know that until many years later. But if you can imagine that as a little girl, I was around a mom who was just kind of always checked out and
Mhm.
just wasn't ever really present. She was conflict avoidant. And so I think that between nature and nurture, and the Enneagram identifies both as well, uh, I learned that if somebody was going to be the adult in the family, if somebody was going to take charge, if somebody was going to be in control, it was going to be me. And so that's the piece that really landed as I read about the childhood wound of the type 8 and how common that kind of a story is with other people who identify at that point.
Wow, the Enneagram goes so deep. Um, to be able to help people identify those core wounds. And you know what is so ironic, Misty, is as I'm listening to you talk, I grew up with a very similar history. My dad was addicted to pain medication.
Ah,
However, that wounding for me unconsciously taught me that I need to help. I need to be the one to step up, to take responsibility, to make sure everybody else around me is okay, to avoid conflict. Because if everybody's happy and nobody's mad, I'll be safe and I'll be okay. So for me, it took a lot of that two energy, struggling with some people pleasing tendencies and trying to move into a more healthy expression of that too. Um, as I was reading about the Enneagram. So isn't that interesting just how, I mean, similar wounds, but the way it lands on us and the way we respond to those wounds is so entirely different.
Yes, yes. And that's what I love about the work is that it can help us understand that we can have similar wounds and respond differently. So the strategies that we develop as a child to manage in those familial situations, according to the Enneagram, can go 9 different ways, if you will. And when you really start to read about that, it helps us to see that it's a combination of nature and nurture also, because each one of us is sort of born with a proclivity, as Dan Siegel refers to it. Also, a characteristic trait, those kinds of words. But also, we're being raised in families where that's true of each of our parents individually as well. And so what I love about understanding how we might have similar woundings but respond differently to it is that each of us is interacting with a parent, and depending on our type and depending on the parent's type, well, that interaction probably ultimately affects the type that we grab onto, because we can all identify with all 9 types. This is not
Absolutely.
it's not definitive like a horoscope or like Chinese birth year, uh, and other typology systems like that. So we can really look at the idea that we all have the ability to identify with all 9 types. We just stack them differently and can vacillate between them differently depending on, using Enneagram language, our level of health.
Well, okay, so there's no rigidity in this model, which I love. I love the flexibility, the fluidity of it. And I'll be honest, so my primary lens as a psychotherapist is internal family systems therapy. But
Yeah,
my gosh, when I was reading these 9 types and I was learning about it just in preparation for this show, I was like,
yeah,
I see my parts. I mean, as an IFS practitioner, I've done a lot of my own work through that lens and I've mapped all my parts, which is a whole nother conversation for another day.
yeah,
But in doing that, I was reading around that Enneagram shape and I was like, oh my gosh, I know, as a 2, here's this part, here's my exile, here's some of my protectors, here's
yeah.
where I feel real safe. And I was just thinking about my own personal work that I've done and I was seeing myself and just in the energy of all 9. And I could definitely see which energies I like to hide in, where I like to shine, where I tend to feel comfort and lean into the most. It was so fascinating to me how well it blended with the modality I already see the world through.
Yes, yeah. So it blends beautifully with IFS, also with CBT, with EMDR. I mean, so that is where kind of how my course was born, is as I was really getting more and more informed on all of the elements of the Enneagram. I saw so many psychotherapy modalities show up. Like here's another one that the work of Karen Horney, who is a German psychologist or psychiatrist. She never knew the Enneagram, but that her work often shows up in different books. And she talks about like the stance, for example, how people move throughout the world, both personally and socially, and the value of just helping our clients see, are you more do you move forward toward people? Do you take more of an assertive, aggressive stance? Do you move backward away from people? Do you take more of a withdrawn stance? Or do you kind of try to match or mirror people? Do you take more of a compliant stance? So that's an example of one of the elements of the Enneagram that I use all the time. And even if, I really have to match the needs of the client. So if clients want to use Enneagram language, then I jump in, completely. But I'm using the Enneagram with all of my clients, and I might really just be talking more about those elements rather than using Enneagram language if they are feeling averse to it or they think it's woo woo or just such a powerful tool to be able to look at, and that's one of about 100 different elements of the Enneagram.
Wow. Okay. So tell me a little bit more about how do you incorporate the Enneagram into your work?
So now that I have officially been doing it for so long, I always ask people's permission. And I'm at that place in my career at this point, kind of like you with IFS. I really get to choose and decide more with the clients I'm working with. And so any new clients that I'm taking on now know the passion of the work that I do and are already willing. But prior to that, I would ask their permission. And I start with an online assessment. I try not to call it a test because I think just the word test, especially when a client is coming into a psychotherapy environment, can be a little offsetting. And so I let them know that I am going to send them a link to a free online assessment that's looking for traits and tendencies and characteristics. So I'll just use kind of a variety of language. Let them know that I want them to answer the questions as honestly as possible. Moving from about age 12 into their early 20s is a good time, because that's when we're going through the stage of individuation. But before some of us have had some of the traumas of young adulthood, and also trying to give them a sense that I'm looking for that nature versus nurture. Even as a child, what were some of the things that you just did very naturally?
Mm.
And then I will have them send the results to me. And I'll always let them know when we're looking at the results that we may or may not know your Enneagram type. Because as I'm asking them to answer the questions with the assessment, of course, we all know with any assessment, it can be affected by many different things. Am I doing the assessment in the morning when I'm really a night owl? Is it especially hot in the room? Did I just have a fight with my husband? Lots of things can affect that. And I also find that helps to release the fear of being put in a box, or because some people see even personality typology similar to diagnosing. They don't want to be put in a definitive box. So I find that by using that language, it really allows them to answer the questions as honestly as possible. I also give all of them the cue: please, as best possible, answer the questions as honestly as you can through that span, 12 to 23, let's say. Try not to answer the questions the way that you think I want you to.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
Try not to answer the questions based on how you would like to be seen or perceived by others. Really try to be as genuine as possible. And that's where we start. So we start with the scores of an online assessment. And then I move into the uncover phase, if you will. And that is where I'm really learning their story and moving more into a assessment interview with probably the first 1, 2, 3 sessions, and get to know them personally to help understand maybe how and why they answered some of the assessment questions the way that they did.
Yeah.
And then usually between about session 3 to 5, we will have landed on what I like to call the top 3. And again, that gives us a little bit of flexibility. I'm not name calling. I'm not saying, you're a 1, you're a 7. Clients don't tend to respond positively to that. But if I can say, gosh, I'm really seeing and understanding how you answered the questions of these top 3, or sometimes we move them around after I start to get to know them, as I start to really understand their story and uncover the motivation behind the way they answer the questions.
Yeah. So, okay, let's get into that, because that I was always so curious about, like, right, the top 3, and maybe those scores for the top 3 aren't even, maybe they're just a few points apart.
Yeah.
So, what does that mean, and how we see ourselves, how we might see a client, when the scores are so close? Is there room for all of that in the Enneagram, and how do you conceptualize that when it happens?
Yes, absolutely. So I recommend, the reason that I train other psychotherapists to use this as a tool is the first step of that is to do the work yourself, like with so many modalities, right?
Yeah.
And with that, we can gain so much knowledge about how those scores can come very close together. And this is where, and not all Enneagram teachers agree with me in this arena, and that's okay. There's room for different opinions. I've had to shift based on how it works in the psychotherapy office, which is different than how it works with a coach who doesn't have the same restrictions and regulations that we do, or a spiritual director who's coming at it from a different place. So that's the reason I use the top three, is so I can have that conversation with clients about how fluid of a tool this is. So for example, my top three scores would be 8, 7, and 3. Now, if you look at those stances that I was talking about earlier, there's 3 of each stance. And it just so happens that the 8, the 7, and the 3 all fall into the assertive stance arena. Mm-hmm. So, for example, if I were working with a client whose scores looked similar to my own and they're very close together, I would be saying, so what I'm getting out of this right away is that your top 3 scores are assertive, assertive, assertive. So that means we probably have some work to do, some opportunity to help you choose when it might be more appropriate to be withdrawn, or when it might be more appropriate to be compliant with different people in different situations. And then, okay, so look back at how my story started. I got involved in this wondering, why am I having all this conflict with people when I don't intend to? Well, if my top 3 scores are assertive, 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 imagine how people were perceiving me, even if I did.
Bump up against people's parts.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, and could be a trigger for for someone else, who had played that role in their life previously. So that's how I use the scores. I let them know to, again, depending on the testing environment, if you will, answering 1 or 2 or 3 questions slightly differently could have adjusted those scores if they're very close together. And that's why, to me, it's less important to definitively identify like a single type, but more important to have a conversation around, it's likely that both the strengths and weaknesses of the 3 top types show up for you in your world. Let me get to know you now. Let me try to understand how those are showing up for you, and how they can sometimes overlap, sometimes contradict each other, and sometimes complement each other. So, for example, if we think that you are accurately typed as a 2, and maybe 3 would show up in your top 3 scores, or some other language would be to say you're a 3 wing, it would be, if I was working with you as a client, I would say, okay, how do these complement each other, and when do they contradict each other? When you, I believe that each type has the ability to overuse their gifts, and that's when you start to see problems with people, when they're overusing the gift of the type.
Wow. Okay. So everything you're saying is so aligned with the work that I do, because when I think from an IFS lens, we think about multiplicity, and multiplicity is so normal, right? I mean, we all show up different in different situations for different reasons. We have several parts at play that sometimes, like you said, contradict or complement each other. And so I think there's so much value in being able to assess how these different types or parts show up in people to honor that multiplicity. So yeah, this feels like it's just speaking to my love languages right now. It is so juicy.
I was super excited when you asked me to join. I can use every opportunity to speak publicly about how beautifully the Enneagram works in psychotherapy.
Wow. Yeah, no, I could see it already just with everything that we've been talking about so far. So, can we kind of break this down a little bit into, what does each number mean? 1 through 9, and maybe just go through and give maybe some high level information about each of the types?
Absolutely. I'd love to give a little history about the Enneagram before I jump into the types. Is that good with you?
Yes.
Perfect. So the Enneagram has historically been a narrative tradition. So it wasn't written down necessarily for many, many years until it kind of landed in the US, and then we shifted everything. but we think, it has roots in like Sufism, some mystical background as well. So some different ideas of where it originated. But one of the pieces of the history that I love to introduce people to is the mathematical piece. So we think that there's some astrology and some astronomy involved here as well, probably around the same time that uh, many different forms of spirituality evolved as well before those turned into religions.
Yeah.
And so people often ask me about the shape of the Enneagram.
Yes.
And so I like to give a little information about that. So the Enneagram the shape is comprised of three different parts that together create the symbol. The first part is a circle. The second part is a triangle. And the third part is abnormal hexad, which is the number 7. And what I love about this is I like to play with numbers a little bit too. And so if you look at the way that the numbers are designed around the symbol, you can see that the circle represents unity, which is 1 divided by 1 equals 1.
Mm-hmm.
The triangle represents trinity. So 1 divided by 3 is 0.33333, infinity. And then the hexad is 1 divided by 7, which equals 0.142857, infinity. And so when you put those all together, that creates the shape of the Enneagram. And so I love that there is sort of some mathematical history to the symbol as well.
Absolutely. I know, and it makes me think about numerology even
Yeah,
too.
yeah,
With
exactly.
some of these numbers and just the meanings in numerology. And now I kind of want to geek out and see how those correlate a little bit, but um I'll have to do some research later.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
yeah.
And I think too that what's interesting, I love to see some of the authors. I am not exactly familiar with who decided to number the 1 through 9.
Mhm.
Uh, but some of the authors out there will actually use other symbols in place of the numbers, because I think whenever we're using a number system like that, you can start to wonder if there's a hierarchy, like, is a 9 better than a 1? Is a 5 better than a 4? And so I like to introduce that idea as well, that no one number is better than another number. And I like to call them like type or point of view is the language that I prefer to use. Each type on the Enneagram has a list of strengths and a list of what we could call weaknesses or opportunities with awareness.
Mhm.
And that's how I am working with people when I'm using this information. So, what do you think is the best way for us to introduce the types? Do you have specific questions, Christy, or do you want me to kind of go around the wheel?
Yeah, let's just kind of go around the wheel 1 through 9. So interesting too, because even in numerology, when I'm thinking about 1 through 9, that matches up to numerology as well. Nine being the number of completion. Um, the symbol looks like sacred geometry, so that in and of itself,
Yes.
is so fascinating. But yeah, I'm thinking maybe we could just go around the wheel 1 through 9, maybe talk about some of the strengths, and I like how you phrase that, some of the opportunities for growth for each of these numbers.
Okay.
Um, and go from there.
Okay, great. And it is sacred geometry, by the way. That is exactly
Mhm.
the symbol. That's where the
Okay,
math comes in. Yeah, yeah.
beautiful.
So I am going to kind of go around the wheel a little different than, I'm going to use a little different language than maybe some of the other labels that people have seen previously. And I'll do a little bit of explanation about that as well. It's really specific to how I use this work in the psychotherapy office.
Okay,
I'm going to
perfect.
start with the type 5, which is a little different. So, in just based on the way my brain works, I kind of go head, heart, and gut.
Mhm.
And that is another example of elements of the Enneagram that have been around forever, and now science is backing up that we have three neurological centers, or three brains, if you will. Some of this comes from like Ayurvedic medicine, different ways of thinking from long ago, and is now being proven by science as well. So the Enneagram is broken up into three centers: head, heart, and gut. And within each center, there are three types. So the types that are in the head type are type 5, 6, and 7. So I'm going to start with type 5. And you'll often hear this in like pop culture as the investigator or the thinker, the professor. And you can see that when we put labels on it like that, it can feel a little bit like name calling. Some people might fit into, might meet criteria to be typed in this category, but don't necessarily want to be put in a box. So I refer to the type 5 as the point of autonomy, study, theory, curiosity, clarity. You start to get a sense of the things that are very interesting to them, where their energy is attracted. The type 6 often will be referred to as the loyalist or the loyal skeptic in some circles. And so I refer to that point as the point of safety, security, dependability, certainty, loyalty. Again, you can see these are not labels as much as they are a desire to bring attention for that point or that type of where their energy naturally goes.
So
The
these are going to
type
be the more
seven,
heady people, the thinkers,
yes,
logic,
exactly.
left-brained types.
Exactly.
Okay.
And so all three of these, the type 5, 6, and 7, are the head types. One of the things that they have in common is a focus on safety and security.
Okay. So
Yeah,
would you say that's where the wound typically lies if we're looking at the nurture part of this versus the nature part of this?
probably. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. What happened in their childhood, real or perceived, that they decided that these are going to be the coping skills, the strategies that they're going to develop to keep themselves safe.
Okay. Gotcha. Right.
Yeah. So the last of the head types is the type 7. Sometimes we hear them referred to as the enthusiast. And I like to refer to them as the point of flexibility, spontaneity, opportunity, possibility. Some people say positivity and gluttony. They tend to want to stay safe and secure by having lots of options.
Mm-hmm.
So those are the three head types.
So how
And
would you
then
distinguish the
yeah, go ahead.
three? You know, what would make a 5, 6, and 7 different from one another?
So it would be how they seek safety and security.
Mhm.
And so the type 5 might attempt to seek safety and security with lots of knowledge. Sometimes they can almost hoard knowledge. Like, you really caught on to the language that I was using there. These are like the professors, the bookworms, the people who are gathering. Sometimes I have discovered, Christy, that people will fall into this category who have like multiple degrees. Does that make
Okay.
sense?
Totally. I
Yeah.
think we all know one, right? I mean, as you're talking about it, I'm getting images of people that I know in my head, like, okay, yes, that person exemplifies, the professor, the 5.
Yes, exactly. So a type 6 is seeking safety and security. And sometimes physically, sometimes emotionally. But for example, there's something really interesting to me about type 6s is that there's certain career paths that are either attractive to type 6s or vice versa. We're not exactly sure, but what those are, like police officers, military folks, firefighters. And you would think, gosh, if they're a fear-based type, head type, and they're primarily seeking safety and security, why would they choose those types of careers that are very dangerous? But what I've learned in working with clients who identify at this point is that they choose those careers to guarantee the safety and security of themselves and others.
Mm, right,
It's
right.
interesting. And
Yeah, it
then the
makes
type and then the type 7 is seeking safety and security through options.
okay. So they sound like a little more fun. Like maybe the type 7 is going to be like the almost sounds like the life of the party, like an it
Yeah,
person.
yeah.
And where
We're,
on the surface it doesn't even seem like safety seeking, but you have to look so much deeper than the surface almost to see that.
which is why this is such an amazing tool in psychotherapy.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah, I kind of joke like the 7 is the type that's going to be dancing naked on the table, and people will say, well, how are they a head type, safety and security? But as you get to know them in therapy, you start to realize they're always in their head thinking about the next adventure. That like they don't want to be boxed in. They don't want to be, and so they're seeking safety through opportunity, through adventure. And gosh, what a great example of something that a topic that just wouldn't naturally come up in
Hmm.
psychotherapy very early in a relationship without a tool like this.
Absolutely. Yeah, and how insightful for people too, because I'm sure they have this innate drive. Um, and maybe the people around them don't even understand, why can't you sit still, or why aren't you satisfied? And maybe they don't understand that drive within themselves either. But yeah, what a tool to be able to understand, well, this is exactly why, right? It's safety seeking, even if it doesn't appear to be that way on the outside.
Exactly. Exactly. So we ended with the type 7. So I'll go into the next triad. And this is, some people call it the body triad. I prefer to call it the gut triad because I think all of these elements create our whole body. But this incorporates the type 8, 9, and 1. And what these three types have in common is a tendency for energy to go toward power and control. And just like you said about the other types, we probably see some of that childhood wounding show up in what they're seeking. So maybe if they were raised in an environment where they didn't have any autonomy, they didn't have any authority, they may have generated a natural draw toward the energy of power and control, but they each do it differently. So, for example, the type 8, some people call this like the leader, boss, challenger. Again, those sound a little name calling to me, and as someone who identifies at this point, I don't necessarily think that I wake up in the morning and am seeking power and control. And I think that even just some of that language can be a bit misleading. So I refer to the type 8 as the point of tenacity, authority, immediacy, honesty, equity. And you think about like, oh gosh, those might not be, that might be great for a military leader, but how about a counselor?
Yeah.
And so when you were talking about the type 2, and we'll get to those in just a minute, something that the type 8 really has in common uh, with the type 2, and there's a line to 2, we probably won't have time to talk about that today, is that the type 8 really looks out for the underdog. So
Mhm.
I've learned in my journey that there actually are, like a lot of these people do end up in leadership positions so that they can help take care of the underdog. But as a counselor, that's probably how this shows up for me is, I think of it like the turtle. The type 8 has a hard exterior shell, but a super soft underbelly that really loves to see people improve their circumstances, feel better, be healthier, those kinds of things.
Can I ask you this? This kind of leads to a question. So in IFS, there's different parts, and each part it's kind of innate to a person. It does take into account nature versus nurture. And in IFS, parts when we're wounded in childhood can be almost pushed outside of their naturally harmonious state into a state of extremes. Is that similar with how the Enneagram would view some of these points? Can they be pushed out of harmony into an unbalanced state in these
Yeah,
energies?
yes, absolutely. And that is something that really has in common with IFS is that, so I refer to this as the gifts and the sins of each type. And that's, some people aren't loving the word sins when they hear it, but in Jerry Wagner's work, he refers to it this way because the original definition of that word is to quote, miss the mark. Like if you think of archery,
Okay.
and so exactly, so if we are like when we use the gifts of our type, it's a beautiful thing when it's done in harmony and health. But we can be pushed to limits um, of healthy ways to use those aspects of our type. So take myself as a type 8. I, who doesn't want a leader on the team? Who
Right.
doesn't want somebody who can, who can do the challenging, who can be a boss, who can step up and take the lead? Everybody wants somebody like that on the team. And when those aspects of this type are being used in a healthy manner, then you're probably not struggling. You're probably not even coming into the counseling office. But when we are pushed to our outer limits, that's when we abuse or overuse the elements of our type. So, for example, it's a great trait to be challenging, to even to be leading. But if you're overusing that, you're going to become a Gestapo. You're going to become an angry, demanding uh, individual that isn't bringing anything good to the people you're around. Does that make sense?
Yeah. It sounds like a deep understanding of the Enneagram and these types leads to compassion ultimately. If I can
Exactly.
understand you, if I can understand why you have these behaviors, why it's been pushed to this extreme, I'm going to be able to come at it with more compassion and more understanding. And I think ultimately that's what we all want, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the second type in this triad, the gut triad, is the type 9, the peacemaker, and which is the name that often gets given to them. And I reframe this and talk about the point of harmony, unity, diplomacy, fidelity, serenity. So again, you get a sense of those words. It is these are individuals who can seek power and control through harmonizing other groups of people, if that makes sense. It's a little
That sounds like a nice
tricky.
skill. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Now, sometimes they can get in trouble when they're not allowing for people to have autonomy and conflict in order to work through something. So when they miss the mark, if you will, it's in trying to play peacemaker in a situation where maybe there needs to be a little bit of conflict, before we all come together.
Are they
And then the
uncomfortable with that conflict?
they're uncomfortable with the conflict, so they have a tendency to always want to be harmonizing, even
Okay.
so. But sometimes the way the type 9s get power and control, and it's interesting since I'm on video here, is they'll kind of do this and they'll stay still in an attempt to gain power and control through forcing peace,
Okay.
which it sounds like a contradiction, and it is. Like, that's so when I'm doing
Right.
work with 9s, that's usually the work that we're doing, is that they see themselves as such gentle, docile individuals, and normally they are. They're
Mhm.
pretty chill, but they're not always chill on the inside, and sometimes they're trying to like play the diplomat when really they might be better off to allow the conflict to play out first, which they're
Okay. And are
uncomfortable
they
with.
aware of what's going on under the tip of the iceberg? I mean, maybe on the outside they're presenting very calm, very grounded, but it sounds like there's a lot going on energetically inside of them, a lot of activation that maybe
Mhm.
they're not even aware of here.
Absolutely. And that'd be true for all
Okay.
the types, Christy, that many
Mm.
of them, they feel disrupted. We all know when we feel disrupted in a way. Some of us are more aware of that than others. But quite
Mhm.
often, we don't exactly understand what's causing that disruption. And I use the Enneagram as a tool to help people understand what's causing that disruption. Because then at least they can be mindful. They can choose. Am I going to do what I naturally do? Or might I make a different decision in this moment or with this person?
Right. Right.
Yeah. So the
Yeah.
third type in this triad is the type 1. Some people call them the perfectionist. And this is actually, when I started changing my language, it was because of the type 1, because it seems like some folks at this point come into therapy often, and they really, I learned about them that their goal isn't perfectionism. Their goal is accuracy. So this is what this is the first type that I started sort of referring to as like the point of accuracy, the point of quality, integrity, consistency, responsibility. You can see how just those words, where my energy is going, they have some things in common. So I refer to the type one when they're overdoing the gift is when they is when they can go to perfectionism, which we all know isn't even possible. But you can see there in that language, like if I stand at the point of accuracy and quality, like that's what I'm seeking. That's where my energy goes. But if I overdo that, I'm going to try to reach for perfectionism, and you can imagine the kind of trouble that causes for people in their
Yes.
daily lives, in their jobs, and especially in their relationships.
Oh, absolutely. And that's probably when they present to you in your office, is at that point when they're pushed to that extreme.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Hmm.
Not knowing
Hmm.
why, not understanding why, So the
Right.
final triad is that we'll talk about here. So we just talked about the type one. We'll start with the type two, and then type three and type four, and they're in the heart triad. And what all three of these types have in common is a tendency to seek affirmation and esteem. So you'll have to let me know, Christy, how this falls for you. So the type two is often referred to as like the helper giver in the naming community. And again, now type twos don't normally shy away from that when we talk about it in the office. They're not offended by it necessarily. But I renamed this the point of connectivity. It could also be called like the point of like generosity, relatability, empathy, but also flattery. I put on here. And now remember what these three have in common is that they are seeking affirmation and esteem. So for the type two, three, and four, um, what other people think of them, how other people see them, means more to them than all of the other types and can become very disruptive. For the type two, at the point of connectivity or relationality, would be another place the energy goes. This is especially helpful to understand because many folks at this point will come into the counseling office after discovering that somebody doesn't like them and they
Mm.
couldn't turn it around. They couldn't figure out what to do to get this person to like them, and they are extremely disrupted by it.
Yeah.
Does any of that fit for you, Christy?
Oh my gosh, yes. And in fact, this is bringing up a story that I'll share with you. So, again, back to my upbringing, which sounds like it was similar to yours in more ways than I initially knew.
Yeah.
When my dad was in the height of his addiction, he was very critical. And for a two, that is harsh. Growing up in a household where you never feel accepted for who you
Mhm.
are,
Yeah.
or seen for what you do. And so, of course, just like you would expect, I grew up to date people who were also addicted. And so I had a boyfriend in my early 20s. And it got to the point with his addiction where I was trying to manage and control it. I was picking him up, taking him to work. His mom would ask me to help out all the time, and I did, as a good two,
Yes.
and as a good codependent, I'm sure. And
Yes.
so I remember I started going to therapy because I was like, I was just so unhappy, right? And I couldn't figure out why. But
Yeah.
anyways, I remember sitting down across from my therapist and I'm like, listen, I'm doing all this in my relationship. I'm exhausted. I'm overwhelmed. I'm trying so hard and nothing's coming from it. And she looks at me, she goes, you're manipulative. And I was like, wait, did you not hear me? I was like, he's manipulative. He's using, he's lying about it. He's not
Yeah.
showing up to work. I'm a student. I'm working full time. I'm doing everything I can. She goes, but does anybody know how you really feel ever? And I was like, no, probably not. And she goes, you're manipulative. And oh my gosh, I walked out and I just cried all the way home. And then I sat with it for a minute and I was like, she's right. I'm so dishonest with myself and other people
Yeah.
about how I feel. I'm always fine. I can always handle more because I don't want to disappoint, because then
Yeah.
somebody might think that I'm letting them down and that would be devastating. And so that was the work of that whole decade for me. That defined my 20s.
I wish you would have had the Enneagram then. So that's
Me
beautiful.
too.
One of the words that comes up with the type 2, and it's interesting because when folks at this point first hear the word, sometimes they get really angry about it. But exactly like what happened with you, when I really have built rapport and can start really getting into, well, let me go back to my language, gifts and sins. The sin of the type 2 would be manipulation. Exactly.
Mm, no
And
way.
often, yeah, and like unintentionally though, right? They're not waking up in the morning thinking, who can I manipulate today? But what it's about is I so am dependent on how I feel about myself based on how other people see me, what they think of me, how they feel about me. That if somebody doesn't like me, it is like a devastating blow to my ego, even if I'm not even aware of what my ego is or how that's showing up or playing out. And other types have a really hard time understanding that. But I love what you're saying there too, because especially when I'm teaching in a group, sometimes when I use, the words that represent the sin of each type, and I will use manipulation for the type 2, and everybody else in the room goes, oh, and the type 2 goes, mm-hmm. Yep. But they normally have, like, they've done their crying beforehand once they really realize how much they have a tendency to get in there and try to force people to like them so that they can feel good about themselves. So the work to do with type 2s is to help them find ways to give affirmation and esteem to themselves and not be so heavily dependent on kudos from everybody else. Because gosh, if you're a type 2 and you're looking for those kudos, and that's what that's what gives you breath, and
Hmm.
somebody doesn't give you kudos, which is totally their right. Like, we know that not everybody's going to like us. But for a very unhealthy too, that could be a devastating thing. And that's the work that we do. And it sounds like you did that work in your 20s.
I did that work in and I still have to work on that daily as
Yeah.
a business owner, right? It's something where
Yeah.
I have to step back and say, okay, am I making a fear-based decision? Am I falling into people pleasing? Or
Yeah.
am I doing what's most aligned in my integrity for myself and for my business? And I have to
Yeah.
constantly ask myself those questions. Now, at least now I have the ability to step back and do that,
Yeah.
since I've done that work. But I tell you, it's daily work.
Yeah, it is. And I
Hmm.
think for all, I think as a therapist in general, I think most of us, sort of agree that uh, self improvement never stops. It's a lifelong
No.
journey, and the more that we understand about neurology, I think that the more that we can see that as well. And some of these proclivities that we're talking about here with Enneagram types, it's built into our neurology. And so it's not like we can even with awareness and mindfulness, it's not like we just stop doing it,
Yeah.
you know?
The feelings
Yeah.
still come up, right? It's just that now they're not below that tip of the iceberg. They're above sea level. It's like, oh yeah, here I go again, right? I'm doing the
Yeah.
thing that I tend to do.
Yeah.
How do I get myself through it? How do I use my skills and resources, to do something
Exactly.
different?
I
Hmm.
I like myself, or I find myself using the language, like catching myself in the act of, and then it's interesting that you just use the word resources also, because one of the ways that I really like that Jerry Wagner talks about this is when we're more resourceful versus less resourceful, and so
Mm.
this language that shows up with the Enneagram as well. So
It's like
let
we're
me
living consciously versus
exactly.
unconsciously once we have these awarenesses.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
So let me run through the other two heart types. So next would be the type 3, and some people refer to this as like the performer, achiever. Now again, when you're with the type 3 and you use that language, they're not necessarily averse because that's a core value for them.
Hmm.
I prefer to refer to them as the point of productivity, the point of efficiency, glory, capacity, vanity. So vanity can kind of be their sin as well. But so this is about with affirmation and esteem. Type 3s are also very concerned about what other people think about them.
Hmm.
And so where they can get in trouble is when they make choices and decisions. It's not so much like the type 2 about other people liking them. It's about how other people see them, and they want to be seen as successful. So when they
Mm.
can get in trouble is because they're doing things to be seen as successful that maybe aren't true. Like, for example, I'm a male type 3 and I just lost my job, but I go out and buy $100,000 truck to drive so that people look at me and believe that I have success through the vehicle that I'm driving, even
Right.
though there might be no truth behind that as well. So type threes are kind of notorious for not doing like the deep cleaning, but they
Hmm.
always want the room to look, picked up.
Yes.
If you will. And then the type 4 is the third in this triad, again, seeking affirmation and esteem, sometimes referred to as like the individualist or the artist. I prefer to refer to them as the point of authenticity, originality, identity, creativity, nonconformity. And we do see a lot of artists fall into this. It's almost like I think of Kurt Cobain, who probably fell into this. Type fours almost find comfort in the melancholy.
Mm.
One of my Enneagram therapist colleagues says they like to bathe in sweet melancholy. Like they take something ugly and dark and horrible and turn it into something beautiful. And we think that this is why we see a lot of artists in this category. And so they really value, they don't value mass production of anything. They really value that individuality. And type fours, one of their greatest strengths is that fours and eights kind of share this. They can really sit in the depths of darkness very comfortably. Whereas,
Mm.
like, the sevens and the twos are trying to say, let's just see the positive side of it. And so fours and eights are pretty good at really, sixes can do this a little bit as well, really getting into the depth of the darkness. Now, sometimes that's the work that I do with fours in the counseling office, is sometimes they're sitting in the depth of darkness so deeply that they get diagnosed as depressed, or they can become depressed, or they're bringing down everyone in the room.
Right. Well, and you hear that a lot from artists that so much creativity is born from the depths or
Yeah,
from the outliers of the emotional spectrum, right? I mean, creativity doesn't happen when things are just status quo and okay.
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Wow.
So, and then just to kind of review for all the listeners, so the three triads are the head, the heart, and the gut. And so for the head, we have the types 5, 6, and 7. For the heart, we have types 2, 3, and 4. And for the gut, we have types 8, 9, and 1. And what each of the types have in common is what they're seeking. What differentiates them within the center is the motivation of why they're seeking that, and the strategy that they use to get that need met. Which again, you hear lots of psychotherapy language in there that spans across multiple modalities.
Wow. I've heard that in the symbol of the Enneagram that the head and the heart types are the furthest apart. And you hear it said in the psychotherapy room so often too that the longest journey that anybody will take is from head to heart. Is that true? Is that what you see at the in the Enneagram?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
for sure.
Hmm. So if listeners wanted to take that free test that you give to your clients, is there somewhere that they could go to do that?
Yeah, so I'm not affiliated with this person at all. He's a single individual. It's a simple test. There's a million assessments out there online right now. He does call it a test, so for this purpose, I will use that. And it's called Eclectic Energies. So just www.eclecticenergies.com.
Okay.
And there are two versions. I recommend the classic version. It's free, it's not fancy, but it is the most thorough assessment that I have found online. There's a couple of other places that I would also recommend that you can go to take more modern, fancier versions of an assessment. So one would be through Enneagram Spectrum, and that's Jerry Wagner. And the other would be through the teachings of Riso Hudson, and that's Enneagram Institute. And you can look either of those up online and go to their assessment page. I think both of those are right around the like $12 to $15 range, but I'm a big fan of the results of both of them.
That's awesome. And so now, if there's other clinicians listening today and they're like, okay, I need this training, I want to integrate this into my work, how do I become an Enneagram empowered psychotherapist? Where would they find you and your training?
So the best place to start right now is I have a Facebook group called Enneagram Empowered Psychotherapists. And if you do a search for it, you can ask to join. I do look at your credentials, so I make sure that, because what I find in that group is that we really want to use psychotherapy language, not necessarily coaching or spiritual director language. And then in that group, I do interviews, I do free trainings, and that's where I am prepping for them to take the course as well. And anybody can also just do a search for my name. Almost everywhere there's a link. So it's Mysti, Mysti Rainwater.com. And anywhere you are social, it's just at Mysti Rainwater, and there's contact information and links there as well.
Awesome. Misty, this was so incredible. Thank you so much for coming on. I feel like I learned so much today and I'm excited to take a deeper dive. I feel like I, just have some surface level knowledge, but
Yeah.
this just hit me right here and felt so relevant to my personal experiences. I'm so ready just to do a deep dive. So thank
I,
you.
I love it. I love it. And I should say on that too, some people ask me, Christy, they say, the Enneagram seems so negative. So because
Mhm.
there is emphasis on the challenges of your type, because that's what causes you disruption, right?
Yeah.
And that's again why it's such a beautiful tool in psychotherapy, because they do talk about the strengths of each type. However, if you're coming into my office as a therapist to talk about all the strengths of your type, I'm going to give you some kudos and you're going to leave and no really good work has been done. So,
Hmm.
so for listeners to understand too, if you ever sort of think that the Enneagram focuses on the negative, it's because that's the stuff that disrupts us. And that's the opportunity in psychotherapy.
I love that reframe right there. That's the opportunity. And I felt like it really does highlight the gifts too,
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
and I think that opportunity, right, probably allows us to utilize more of those gifts, to be more authentic to ourselves, to have more self
Mhm.
compassion and self awareness. And
Yeah.
that's how we share our gifts with the world, right? So
Exactly.
transmuting those negatives, turning them into full expression.
I
So
love it.
thank you so much.
You are so welcome. Thank you, Christy.
All right. Have a good day. We'll talk to you soon.
Thanks.
All right. Bye.